Good evening and welcome to our second edition of the Silent Observer. Tonight we have a whole bunch of goodies for you. We have a book report on Terence Dickinson's new book called Night Watch, and our special guest this evening is Chris Rakowski, astronomer, BSc, and Chris has just come out with a small book for the federal government called The Role of Astronomical Instruments in Arms Control Verification. Chris, what exactly are we trying to verify with our astronomical instruments?
Well, the intent of the book, Guy, was to find out exactly whether astronomical instruments can be used or are presently being used to assist programs in verification either internationally or nationally. The verification itself involves determining exactly the function and purpose of satellites presently in orbit or for satellites that will be going up soon.
Well, how do we tell if there are any nuclear weapons on board any of these satellites? Are there ways that we can tell through our instruments or just looking?
Actually, the amount of information that we can obtain by the simple visual observation of satellites is quite remarkable. We can determine, for example, its mass by its particular characteristics of its orbit. We can determine its purpose by, for example, its altitude, whether it's a very high satellite or a very low one. The lower satellites are obviously reconnaissance satellites of some form. Higher satellites in geosynchronous orbit are obviously for other purposes. We can determine purposes other than that through various configurations. How big the satellite is, for example. Does it have large antennae? Does it have some large heat dampers? That sort of thing.
Solar arrays.
Solar arrays is another good example, precisely. Does it have transmission capabilities? All these things which we can determine optically, either by photographic methods or visually, are very, very useful for finding out exactly what these satellites are for. And in that sense, we can have a good idea of whether these things are good satellites or bad satellites.
Chris, what are some of the astronomical instruments that scientists use to determine what type of satellite is exactly in a specific orbit?
Well, I've brought with me some slides to show this in some detail. If we can have the first one. This first slide is one of the very first slides of Sputnik going overhead in the late 1950s. It was used, or rather it was sent up as a test and also to gather some information, and this is how it appeared. And now it's interesting that for the first few months after Sputnik went up in the late 1950s, the only way that anybody had, except the Russians obviously, of tracking Sputnik was with amateur astronomers, many of whom were stationed in Canada. I think the next slide shows a group of individuals who were tracking. You can see all the people. This is actually on a rooftop in a building in the United States, although the ones in Canada were very similar. Just a group of people with telescopes arranged so that you could sit comfortably and look up to track satellites. And with large numbers of people, they were able to make various types of measurements and determine some of the orbital elements of the satellite. So that's quite a long time ago. Since then, we've progressed a little bit. The next slide, of course, shows NORAD Space Defense Center. This is where most of the tracking is done these days. Everything is sent via various telecommunication services into NORAD. Tracking satellites. They track quite a number of satellites each day. Next slide will show, it's cut off a bit, but it's another dual system of observing the sky to track satellites.
One guy goes up and down, one guy goes up and
something like, yes, precisely it, yeah. Next slide. This is, again, a little more sophisticated. This is the telescope in Alberta at Cold Lake. It's called the Baker-Nunn system, and its purpose was specifically to photograph satellites using a special kind of film, and then the film was developed very quickly, and the information was analyzed and passed on to NORAD. Next slide. Of course, the trouble with photographs is that it takes time to develop and time to examine them, so several of these installations were developed around the world. These are called geode systems for ground-based electro-optical deep space surveillance. There are about 5 of these around the world, one in Hawaii, one in Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, and others throughout the world. The next slide shows you what's in there. This is a very, very powerful telescope, more powerful than anything the civilians have of this size, because it's coupled to a sophisticated charge-coupled device and a very sophisticated computer system.
Can you explain what a charge-coupled device is?
A charge-coupled device, well, because the human eye has imperfections, and we're really not too good at picking out very faint objects by ourselves, charge-coupled devices actually count the numbers of photons, that is, the light rays or particles that are coming from distant light sources. And with that, you're able to get a very, very good picture of what is being observed at that time.
What size would that sort of telescope?
That particular one is still quite small, only about 20 to 24 inches in diameter.
Well, that's across the mirror itself.
The mirror diameter, yes. Yes. The next slide shows you again. This is some of the software that's hooked up with that computer. The charge-coupled devices feed directly into the main computers in these geode systems, where the operators can select out particular paths. Here somebody has selected out a satellite that's in a particular orbit. You can see on his screen. Next slide, please. Again, here's some more of the hardware that they use to track. The next slide, please. And yet another slide. So you can see that this is quite a sophisticated system, and there are several of these around the world. The next slide shows what is actually seen on a typical screen. What has happened is that in this case, there are 2 instances. Either the computer operator can select objects by himself, or the computer can select objects itself to track. The computer operator has selected those 2 objects that are in those rectangles as being possible candidates for satellites of interest. So what it does, the computer operator then sends a signal to the computer to track and keep cursors on those satellites over a period of several seconds. The next slide shows the consequences of that, where we have these tracks. Because we have the object's speed and their luminosity and their direction, it can be calibrated against the central computer banks, and we can tell exactly what satellites those are.
So how many satellites could they pick up on one screen at one time?
Well, I suppose it's not really limited by the number of satellites that are in one screen at one time, because there can be several dozen, I imagine, in one particular screen, depending on the size of the image. But I think it's the more limiting factor is the objects of interest that they're concerned with. The next slide, please. Now, of course, we're not solely limited to the optical systems. This is a radar installation in the far north. Again, this is also used to track satellites. The next slide. This is one of the large phased array radars. This is one at the Egwin Air Force Base in the United States.
Cement or?
No, actually, you may not be able to see that very well, but it's a very, very large stop sign shaped a bank of individual radar cells. And because of the large number of cells, it's able to detect things very, very far away. Next slide. Again, the orientation is a little off here, but this was the re-entry of Skylab over Australia a number of years ago. And it was tracked quite well. In fact, it's suspected that all the brouhaha about where it was going to crash was all sort of a red herring, because with the equipment.
These small pieces you see beside, are they parts breaking off, or are they stars?
I believe those are stars, actually. Yeah. Next slide, please. This shows you some of the different types of satellites. Again, I had indicated to you how there were different types of satellites and how we can tell what was in them. The smaller satellites like the Intelsat 3 are fairly small, and if you observe the satellite that small, you could infer certain things about it. You notice that Intelsat 4 is a little bit bigger. Molniya 2 has different banks, solar panels, etc. on it. The very large satellite in the upper right is a Big Bird satellite. It's just its nickname.
I notice it doesn't have any name or anything like all the others have.
It's a spy
names.
satellite, is what it is. And what it does, it goes into relatively low orbits and takes very detailed pictures. This is the type of satellite that's rumored to be able to take the pictures of the license plate numbers in the Kremlin parking lot and so on.
It can actually change orbit.
The Big Bird can change orbit, very limited, but it's placed in very specific orbits and is up for a very short period of time. Yeah. Next slide, please. And just as an aside, this last slide here shows what is known as the ASAT technology. This is a killer satellite where this is launched from an aircraft and sent up to destroy a satellite. Of course, it's never been anything other than tested so far. It hasn't actually been used on an alien satellite. But these are some of the technology breakthroughs that are being examined now in some detail.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's really interesting, some of those slides.
Yeah, you can see very much how the astronomical equipment is being used. For example, on the Big Bird, it's largely optical equipment, again with charge-coupled devices, which are used by astronomers on the ground as well in civilian research. The devices are very common, but much more sophisticated because they have a lot of money behind them. And I've made the pitch that maybe astronomers should get a little more breaks in this regard.
Well, how are they actually involved in using this information, astronomers, for tracking the satellites? Do we have access to all the big satellite tracking stations for their files so that we can look for new stuff of an astronomical interest?
No, as a matter of fact, this is one thing that we're trying to work through right now. There are individuals in the United States, civilian astronomers, who are trying to get the tapes of some of these geode systems because, of course, with the very sophisticated, very sensitive nature of these systems, you can pick up very faint objects. And if you can pick up very faint objects, they can be used for comet hunting, quasar detecting, and so on. Unfortunately, because of the military nature of the geode systems, because of the Secrecy Act, it's impossible to get these things out to civilian astronomers. But we're trying, and at this point, astronomers have a very limited role in using these sophisticated optical astronomy equipment.
Is that a nice piece of sophisticated optical astronomy?
This is one of the very early satellite observing systems that were used in the good old days before we had these very sophisticated computers. You can see that the individual would look through this lens and then they would be able to observe the sky very well. It's a very primitive sort of thing, but it served its purpose very well.
That's an elbow telescope. Is that what they used with the Moonwatch?
This was
project?
used with the Moonwatch project, as it was called, you're correct, and again, there were several groups in Winnipeg that, there was a group in Winnipeg, but many in Canada that made use of this, and they contributed a great deal to our knowledge of satellites and their motion. In fact, without these Moonwatch programs, we wouldn't have had Apollo and the later Skylab series.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, for bringing your slides along. They were most interesting. And your book, I've read through parts of it, and I find it most interesting. Maybe you'd like to tell our viewers where they can obtain a copy, if they can?
Well, it's been released and is now available through the Government Publication Service of the External Affairs Canada, so I believe if they wanted to, they could make inquiries through there. Most of the government document repositories in Canada should have copies available if you're interested.
Yeah, once again, The book by Chris Rakowski, University of Manitoba, is called The Role of Astronomical Instruments in Arms Control Verification. And like I said, I read through it and I found a lot of the things that Chris brings up in this book are very, very true. Not enough time is given to astronomy with these instruments, which are certainly capable of doing very extraordinary astronomical feats.
And I touch just briefly on the famous Star Wars that everybody's talking about. It's been a delight being a guest on your show, Guy.
Thank you, Chris. Please come back again. I think we'll have to do some more interviews with you. I understand you're also involved in Manitoba Mysteries, looking
for things that go bump in the night.
Bump in the night, yes.
Yeah.
Astronomers that are starstruck.
Unusual objects that are observed in the sky, yes. Very fits perfectly in line with this research.
Thank you very much, Chris. This evening, ladies and gentlemen, we also have a book report for you. I have this book, which I picked up from Terence Dickinson. It's called Night Watch. As you can see from the cover, a gentleman looking through a celestron telescope. I have read the book, and I have found it extremely interesting. It's very, very generalized for the younger generation. The star maps are good. The photographs are very, very good. In color. And what I like about this book in particular is that it's loose leaf bound or coil bound, which enables you to take it out to the observatory at night, and it doesn't tend to tear away. The star charts in it are done with not a lot of stars. They are a minimum of stars, which provides for the younger people to find the constellations in the sky without too much hassle. I would certainly advise purchasing this book if you are a new astronomer just getting into astronomy. It's by Terence Dickinson, once again, and it is ideal if you're starting out and you want a book to read through, even if you're an armchair astronomer. It's ideal. It's very good reading. Thank you once again, Chris, for being on our show. And now over to our news reader.
Good evening. In the news tonight, Comet Wilson to be bright next year. On August 5th, 1986, Christine Wilson, a student at Caltech, discovered a new comet. Wilson found the comet on a photographic plate she made while working on the new Palomar Sky Survey. Wilson originally estimated the comet's magnitude at 7.5, but other observers confirmed that it actually shone about 10.5. Upon calculating the comet's orbit, Brian Marsden from the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory discovered that Comet Wilson should reach third magnitude and develop a bright tail by April 22, 1987. At this time, it will be 1.2 astronomical units from the Sun and just 0.7 astronomical units from the Earth. For Northern Hemisphere viewers, the best view will be around April 1st and May 20th, 1987, on either side of perihelion. The comet will then be about fifth magnitude. For the Star Watch telephone line for astronomical information, call 1-900-410-7827. That's 1-900-410-7827 for additional information. Note that there is a 50-cent charge for Canadian calls. The second item, fog in space. Space station astronauts will be able to enjoy fresh vegetables and fruit thanks to a fog system that will provide crops with moisture and nutrients with no need for soil. Tom Mee, a cloud physicist, has created the cloud fog system, which protects citrus fruits from frost and greenhouses from heat by blanketing them with fog. The creation, a dishwasher-sized console, controls a network of nozzles that shoot droplets of water so tiny that they stay suspended in the air, creating a fog. In space, crops surrounded by the fog will grow with the roots suspended so that they get nutrients and water without being embedded in soil. What is not used of the crop will be recycled as a nutrient. Nothing is wasted in space, says me. Balloons instead of shuttles. Astronomical investigation can be very expensive these days. That's why a 200-year-old technology, ballooning, is still alive and well. 50 or more balloons will be launched this year from the National Scientific Balloon Facility at Palestine, Texas. Floating 130,000 feet above the Earth at the boundary between air and space, various balloon-borne experiments will look at pulsars and study cosmic rays for clues to the origin of the universe. One experiment will be a gamma-ray telescope weighing 2 tons, built by a team from Caltech. The telescope is like a multiple pinhole camera. It will examine pulsars and other astronomical sources of gamma rays. 2 targets are Cygnus X1 and X3, which may be black holes. The balloons for these payloads are huge, sometimes reaching volumes 300 times that of the Goodyear blimp. Compared to the cost of a multi-billion-dollar space shuttle, they are also very cheap. $45,000 to buy the balloon and about $6,000 to fill it with helium. The Caltech experiment will be launched this fall when the high-altitude winds reverse direction and it stays calm at high altitudes for long periods of time. The balloon will then stay in one place for 30 or 40 hours. And last item, planet Mercury visible at the end of the month. Looking southeast about 45 minutes before sunrise, on the morning of November 30th, a slim crescent moon will be in the area along with Mercury and Venus. Venus will be above and to the right of the moon, with Mercury half as high and to the left of the moon. It should be good photographic material. Use a medium-sized telephoto lens on a tripod. Exposure times of 1/2 second, 1 second, 2, 5, and 10 seconds should get good results no matter what type of film you're using. Now, back to you, Guy.
Well, we have a little competition for our viewers tonight. I'm going to ask an astronomically related question, and a prize will be awarded to our first viewer that manages to get the right answer and written in to our mailing address. The question that I'll be asking tonight is, can you name the brightest star in our sky? And this excludes the sun. And also, RASC members are not eligible to enter this competition. We'd have too many answers. Okay, the question again is, can you name the brightest star, excluding our sun, in our sky? Once again, thank you for watching The Silent Observer. Be looking forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time. Good evening.
This is VPW.